1989. As the Iron Curtain fell, Eastern European countries quickly integrate into a globalizing world economy. Within just 3 decades, Central, Eastern, and Southeastern European economies, also called CESI countries, have doubled trade as a share of GDP. Foreign direct investment into the region has increased 7-fold. Global supply chains have created more efficient and specialized production by drawing on countries' relative strength. CESI countries have quickly integrated into global supply chains. That means they are importing intermediate goods from elsewhere and integrating these into the goods they are exporting. By 2018, a quarter of CESI exports are imported inputs from other countries. And in turn, over half of CESI exports are used as inputs for production by other countries. For example, European businesses have been outsourcing or shifting production to CESI countries to take advantage of lower-cost skilled labor, including the German, French, and Italian automobile industry, which outsources to the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. These regional supply chains contribute to strong trade and foreign direct investment linkages between advanced European countries and CESI. 61% of CESI exports go to advanced European countries, and another 13% to CESI countries. For foreign direct investments, 86% comes from advanced European countries. And with this integration come clear benefits: lower transaction costs, greater production efficiency, faster technology diffusion, and faster cross-country convergence in living standards. Living standards in CESI continue to rise closer to those in the advanced European countries. Despite these gains, threats to globalization have begun to appear. While globalization has helped to lift more than 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, discontent at the real and perceived uneven distribution of the benefits drive a popular backlash and trade tensions. During the pandemic, those threats increased as shortages of intermediate inputs and labor, together with jammed logistical systems, disrupted supply chains. Motor vehicle manufacturers reported shortages of intermediate goods, which were still being felt at the end of 2022. Suppliers' delivery times shot up sharply, while they have since come down. The specialization in supply chains, which fostered production efficiency, became a source of fragility. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. The war and reduced gas deliveries by Russia led to major realignments in energy and agricultural commodity markets. In particular, Europe quickly achieved a sharp reduction of reliance on Russia for natural gas imports through determined policy action. Together, the pandemic, the war, and global geopolitical tensions have led to a greater number of protectionist measures. High-tech sectors linked to national security or strategic competition are among the most affected. Europe is no exception to these trends. The EU has started limiting the entry of foreign firms while encouraging domestic production, especially in strategic sectors, such as semiconductors. European exporters also face rising barriers. For example, in the US, new green subsidies favor local production. Such green subsidies can help achieve climate goals, but can also distort investment decisions and global supply relationships. In this changing landscape, firms are increasingly looking to relocate production to make supply chains more resilient and less vulnerable to geopolitical tensions. Words like reshoring, nearshoring, and onshoring increasingly appear in company earning calls and annual reports. How would greater trade and FDI fragmentation, caused by increasing protectionist measures, affect the economic prospects of CESI countries? Will the region take a hit? Or could it also benefit from possible realignments of supply chains? And how can policies help enhance the resilience of, and benefits from, cross-border supply chains.
Okay, let me now invite my distinguished panelists to the stage. Debora Revoltella, Chief Economist of European Investment Bank. Vazil Hudak, Chairman of investment company Avanea. Alain Florence, International Automotive Purchasing Specialist. And Joseph Francois, Managing Director at World Trade Institute. Thank you all. Madam Revoltella, let's start with you. We've seen the benefits for CESI countries in terms of globalization, interconnection, trade. What kind of a setback do we have with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine in terms of disruption of supply chains?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think what we saw in this very nice movie prepared by the organizer, I think it's a very successful story of development and integration that is behind the success of Central Eastern Europe. And I think the GROW model was very much based on this integration in trade, FDI, and that also brought the technology transformation and the improvement in terms of skills. And all of this integration in the value chain is really being part of the growth story, but also part of the resilience of the region. We do a lot of work at the micro level, looking at how things develop in the industrial point of view. And what we saw for the region is that, in fact, the European Union per se is confirmed as the trade facilitator and driver of innovation for the region. And we see a causal effect that goes between FDI and trade and the transfer of technology and improvement in managerial practice. So really the GROW model was, for the region, was very much improving through technological development and the skills, passing through the integration of the value chain. And that's quite important also because it proved to be a driver of resilience at the time of the pandemic. When the pandemic came, the resilience of firm was very much based also on being a part of the value chain and actually being a part of a group in particular of international groups. What we see, and that's a work that we did together also with the IMF and the EBRD, was that at the global level overall, resilience was very much based on policy support and access to finance, remaining access to finance. In CE in particular, there was this additional effect of being a part of a group. So being a part of the value chain, being a part of international group was an additional source of resilience for firms. And that also helped on the adaptation capacity of firms, because the more productive firms, those with foreign ownership, part of value chain, with better management, were also the ones that were adapting more. And the same we see with the trade disruption that we see now, that we have seen in the last years. Firms in Central Eastern Europe have been quite affected as well by trade disruptions, but it's also true that the shock has been reabsorbed and firms have been able to adapt to the shock. And what we see is that the majority, the more productive, more innovative digital firms, they were likely to adapt, more likely to adapt, and the adaptation strategy was on diversifying sources of finance. So opening more and making more resilient their supply chains. And those that were doing this diversification, if you want, so opening more, becoming more resilient, are also those that then see more growth opportunities. So in fact, you see the positive is that you see that you get more and more a group of firms that are part of the value chain, and they are strong and resilient, and they do the right move when the shock comes. On the other side, you have a risk of some other firms that are less dynamic. So working on the passing the benefits from the leading firms to the others is something that remain quite important. You have this risk a bit of polarization. It goes through the spillover that you have, so everything that we discuss in terms of diffusion of innovation, diffusion of skills, development of skills is very much important for the passing through to the rest of the economy.
Thank you for now. Mr. Francois, how to achieve the needed level of resilience? Which industries are let's say, mostly endangered in these unstable times? And can we, when we draw the line, can we see this as an opportunity and not as a risk or challenge?
Yeah, so approaching this as an academic and looking for things for my graduate students to work on. We've had a number of natural experiments recently that we probably would not want to have had, right? The epidemic, or the pandemic, the Brexit as well, I should mention that, the conflict in Ukraine. And these have all stress tested the global supply chains, the systems by which they're run, and some lessons have come out of it. So at the beginning of the pandemic, McKinsey surveyed a number of firms asking what their plan was to deal with exactly how do we ensure resilience. And at the time, what the response was, oh, we're going to diversify our supply sources. Right? They went back about a year later, and oh, no, we didn't actually do that. Right? Instead, we figured out it was much cheaper to keep the supply chains we had and to buy more warehouse space. Right? So inventories now are back in fashion again in a sense, because that's the way to deal with temporary shocks. A lesson there is that in terms of short-term resilience, it seems avoiding exposure to the shocks may mean, a boring thing of inventories. But in addition, it means that it's the long-run determinants that probably matter more. Right? And so the lesson there is, if you want to think about being integrated into supply chains, it's really these long-run determinants of why firms buy into a location, which means infrastructure. It means, as was just mentioned, access to skilled labor. So if I'm based in Switzerland now, where about half of GDP is exported in value-added terms, most of that is intermediates that feeds into elsewhere in the region. It's on the high end of the supply chain because there's heavy investment in the federal university system and in having scientists and engineers and so on, which affects the decision of firms in terms of where they go. Mm-hmm. Right? And so those infrastructure decisions certainly matter. The other natural experiment with Brexit, which also shows the risk of populism and economic nationalism to some extent, has shown that rules matter, and magical thinking that you can get around having to do paperwork and pass type certification and so on doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Right? So we're seeing parking lots of trucks on the highways as firms are stuck waiting to get things processed and cleared. So there's clearly an advantage to being inside the single market and to being inside a framework that facilitates clearance and recognition of standards, allowing the products to move across borders smoothly. And so that's an important aspect of being integrated in supply chains as well. And an important thing to keep in mind as a lesson, as a response to sort of the economic nationalism and populism that's been threatening the further integration in Europe. And indeed, if I take the vehicle sector, for example, essentially since the Brexit vote, we haven't seen major investment in vehicle production in the UK. The Japanese were using the UK as a major point for production. That's not going to continue moving forward. that's now become clear with cost analysis of making electric cars. And so being inside, regionally being inside the single market is important. If I take, again, back to Switzerland for a minute, where they're not a member of the EU, but they're heavily integrated in the single market. And it's interesting, so Bern has an airport, even though it's a relatively small place. And if you've seen the movie Casablanca, it's sort of like that airport at the end of the movie, right? So there's the guys who check you in are the ones who check your boarding pass, or the ones who fly the plane. You expect to be livestock blocking the runway sometimes. But that airport's there because there are people flying just about every day to Brussels, right, to talk about the mutual recognition framework they have, the way that they ensure that standards are recognized and they can move stuff back and forth. That's important, right? And so those regulations and trying to cooperate on that stuff matters. What also comes out of all of that, again, is this message on infrastructure, both human capital infrastructure. It's boring, but physical infrastructure matters, right? So time on highways matters. Being supportive when, now that's not governments, but as multinationals are going and putting in these fiber optic cables across continents and across the oceans, those things are important as production becomes more information concentrated. And finally, just for a minute, there was some back and forth or collusion between the committee or this group beforehand in terms of topics to talk about, one of which is kind of what have we learned about strategic sectors, right? And before the mix of COVID and Brexit and also the conflict in Ukraine, strategic sectors would be things like semiconductors and AI and so on and so forth. Now it's turned out that some of it's more boring, right? It's food, it's gas, it's fertilizer. But some of those things also then critically feed into supply chains, right? Chemicals, fertilizers feed into production in agriculture. The ability to ship agricultural products at the primary level affects supply chains for food further down. So we're seeing that stuff that we thought was kind of maybe didn't look so sexy tech-wise is important, right? And in a sense, we didn't think about that stuff because it's like when you're at home and the lights work and the plumbing works, you don't notice. Right? And then it gets disrupted, and you notice it very quickly when it's dark. And
if we speed up the green transition, maybe those sectors will change again.
But we'll come back to that.
Mr. Hudak, you come from a country that is in Central Europe that had also the benefits of this interconnections. What's your position about the things that happened in the last couple of years in those disruptions? How did basically the companies faced those disruptions, and what would be some general answer to that in the future?
Yeah, well, certainly I think the experience of COVID, experience of Ukraine war, obviously very tragic and right at the border. My country of origin is Slovakia, although I live in Prague and worked at the EIB in Luxembourg, so kind of European citizen. But all these experiences, which are relatively recent, they changed our paradigm of thinking, both on the personal but also corporate and national level. Even on the corporate level, I think we all have kind of our own supply chains and resilience. I don't know how you do, but at least in our house, we have certainly COVID masks. We have COVID, this plastic nasty stuff that you put on yourself. We have some antibiotic supplies. We have a lot of toilet paper, of course, yes, just in case. And of course, we put on the roof, we put photovoltaic to be independent from the energy point of view. And my wife even made me drill a well, next to the house, so we have our own supply of water. So whether it's needed or not, I don't know, but there it is. So even on kind of personal and family level, I think that people are looking differently at the world, having a different understanding of what supply chain means and resilience mean. Certainly, huge changes on the national and regional level. I think when you look at China, actually China started with its own kind of captive supply chain many years ago. They are smart, they are thinking in strategic ways, so the way how they gradually acquired strategic raw materials around the world, how they bought pieces of land in different parts of the world. I think this was, in a way, kind of preparation for these situations of disruptions in the supply chain. Now, what I see is that there is a kind of competition for creating different supply chains. I call them captive supply chains. In the United States, of course, we have IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically aimed at bringing innovative industries and investments in the US by providing a lot of tax incentives and financing, especially for clean tech type of investments, which of course then means that many companies from Europe are looking into US for such opportunities. In Europe, we heard, and there is an effort, for example, with this Net Zero Act, which I think is very good effort on the regulatory side, but what I'm missing is the financial part, which is still very weak, and for the companies, this is something that is missing. But on the corporate level, maybe what I would do, because I like to be more kind of specific, and I was, when I was Minister of Economy in Slovakia, and you probably know that Slovakia is the largest producer of cars in the world per capita. So when I was Minister of Economy back in 2015-16, we managed to bring Jaguar Land Rover to Slovakia. It was actually their first out of UK operation and production. So it was quite a complex process, of course, of negotiating, etc. They have their own priorities for selection of the country. And now I'm engaged in another potential big investment by another OEM. I will not mention the name, but I was kind of putting in mind the different criteria back in 2015-16 versus today. And I think it's interesting to compare. So with Jaguar Land Rover, obviously this was combustion engines and cars based on combustion engine. Now it's only electric, no combustion. Secondly, very important at that time, of course, was availability of cheap and skilled labor force. To some degree, it's still there, but I think our countries have moved, obviously. It's not cheap, skilled, question mark, because when you look at e-mobility, when you look at the battery, etc., I mean, basically electric cars, 40%, 50% of electric cars are batteries, and 30% is software, etc. Only the rest is kind of mechanical stuff, which was initially, back in all times, this was the main part of manufacturing. So skilled and cheap labor force is not so important, also because it's very much robotized, automatized production. What is important today for these guys when they're deciding where to go is availability of green energy in big amounts. So we are talking about terabytes of green energy. Question mark whether nuclear is or not green, at least for Slovakia, where over 50% is nuclear, it is an issue. Different views. For Chinese producers, this is not a problem. For some European, it is. Price predictability and what is the level of price. This is very important for these producers and investors. Availability in the close vicinity of battery production for the e-mobility is a very important issue. This is very interesting, for example, when looking at different countries in our CC region. I think it's quite interesting to look at what's happening in Hungary. Hungary de facto became, in the last 3-4 years, the biggest manufacturer in Europe of batteries for e-mobility, especially through the investments by CATL, BYD, Chinese, South Koreans, and whatever you may think about Hungary and the management of Hungary in terms of economic policy, it is very interesting how they are positioning Hungary as a new hub for e-mobility. And then, obviously, incentives, financial, non-financial incentives for bringing such investments are very important, and here the competition begins. So I think this is a quite interesting illustration, how the world has changed just in 6-7 years in terms of how specific investors are looking at such opportunities.
Thank you for now. Great observations and great intro for our automotive industry specialist. This was the industry that was always mentioned when these disruptions were the topic. What do you see as the main changes that will be made in this industry in the context of production, in the context of prices, and of course this energy transition that was already mentioned?
Yeah, in fact, the automotive industry was willing to change the way of doing before the pandemics and etc. Just because we have in the automotive industry to be very, very flexible. And if you remember the history, in the 80s we had the Japanese coming in, and it left us about 10 years to adjust before they really were selling like crazy in Western countries. Then came the South Koreans, and they left us only 5 years. And we know that the Chinese will now left us only 3 years maximum. So we have to be as flexible as possible. And what happened in the world with the pandemic, the war, etc., has just speed up the process. So how did the automotive industry react in front of the disruptions? First of all, they reduced the production level. Then they reduced the working time, of course, and they gave priority to, of course, the best profitable cars. It means the luxury premium cars and those low-cost cars such as the Dacia cars, because that's where they have the maximum profit. So as a result, of course, if you were intending to buy a car in 2021, 2022, instead of waiting 3 to 4 weeks for your new car, you had to wait 4 months to 6 months. But whatever, it was still possible to get a car. So we had to face different questions, different issues at the same time. So moving from the combustion engine to VEs, then we had to face the Chinese coming in. We had, so the overall production volume has been down, and it's going to stay down for a while. And I don't see any reason in my mind to increase again to those levels we knew before, just because the what we face in life is a change in the young generation mentality. They prefer to rent a car instead of owning their car. Then you have a development of homework, so no more need of more cars on the road. So, and the price we reach currently for the cars is so high for most of the people, even in the most developed countries, that finally they will move to used cars or low-cost cars, and that will create a problem for the transfer to combustion engine cars to EV cars, because EV cars will stay at a high level of price. So we're going to have to consider that for a while, even if there is a decision to cut the combustion engine cars in 2035 in Europe. I mean, it's going to be impossible. And if everybody does it, whatever, we're not going to have power enough for the EV cars. So we're going to keep with the combustion engine for a while. So this means that there will be a trend of splitting. We already see that in the organizations. A couple of constructors have already changed their structures to separate what is EV cars and traditional cars. And at the same time, they changed their partnerships and the shareholders structure. And the most of the time they introduce some Chinese in order to just help and control. And so there will be some opportunities for certain countries where the development of EV cars will be slower, to just focus on the traditional production in order to have a smoother ramp up with the EV cars. So that will help, in my mind, the process of investment in this field. Regarding the concentration, the worldwide sourcing, we're still going to have some, let's say, things that we cannot change. As an example, a lot of countries, mostly developing countries, impose some counter trade, so you need to buy from them if you want to sell cars. Some of them impose even that you have a partnership with a local company, very often with a minority stake, in order to produce on their ground, and so on. So it means that we're going to continue to have international sourcing, but maybe the most part of it will be more focused on Europe for us.
If I understood correctly, you have great news for everyone in the audience who intend to buy a car. They will be more expensive, they will have to wait for them longer. Yeah. And if they buy electric vehicle, it's a question if they will be able to plug it in.
Yeah, okay. That's why they will rent it instead of buying it.
I think we have to take into account that Chinese already starting production of EV cars with the price around 10,000 euro per car, electric cars. So. Yeah. let's be aware of this. Yeah.
Do you think it's a long-term plan to? I mean, can they make this project valuable in the long term?
Well, I think what we are already seeing now is that China is basically rolling over European producers. China in the last 10 years from zero went to #1 in terms of exporter of the cars. They just, I think a few months ago, they went ahead of Japan as #1. Germany is quite far, #3. And you know, this change from combustion engine to electromobility, the fact that Europe does not have its own battery industry, and battery industry is important not only for electromobility, it's very important also for battery storage. With the heavy move towards renewables, you have a lot of impact of the intermittent sources of electricity from photovoltaic, from wind, etc. on the grids. And the grids are not able to deal with that. Basically, you need to have very heavy battery storage systems next to these renewables, which means that you need batteries for both electromobility and storage. And Europe does not have this industry. So when we were at the EIB, Debora would remember, we supported back in 2000, I think it was 15, no, later 18, we supported first kind of European battery producer, Northvolt, created by two guys who used to work for Elon Musk at Tesla, came back to Sweden, created this company. I think it was very, very good and important, but since then you don't see much support from the European side. And what you see is mostly Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese battery producers coming to Europe. So we are losing this whole kind of industrial sector as a European industrial sector. And I think it's a big issue how Europe is going to deal with this huge change, and mobility will be one of those. Whether German, French, Italian car producers will be able to compete with Chinese, who have big advantage of coming with the long experience of electromobility, their own supply chains for batteries with software, etc. It's a big question.
Madam Revoltella, in terms of crisis, there is always the need for greater cooperation between the institutions, governments, private sector. Which policies do you find that are necessary to put Europe back in position where we have a bigger level of non-dependence. Let's call it that way.
I would answer starting actually, if you allow, answering
okay.
attaching one moment to what Vazil was just saying, but bringing it to your questions. I think the point that you are making on the automotive industry and the transformation on the battery side, etc., is extremely important because to me the concern, we always say Europe develops in crisis period, etc., but also the industrial, the value chain that we have seen have been the backbone of the development for the region, have to evolve thinking at what are the future challenges. And one of the biggest future challenges that I see is the net zero transition and the fact that there needs to be a radical shift in some industries, particularly the high energy intensive industry, a radical shift in the way in which they are managing, producing firms. And what we look at, we were looking at the firms according to their energy intensity, and through a survey that we run regularly, we ask one question that is if firms are changing their technologies or business areas to go into less energy intensive fields. And what happens particularly to the group of the very high energy intensive firms that at a certain point will have to change. They will not be able to continue to in the same path. What you see is that in Central Eastern Europe, there are 40% of these firms are looking into new activities and transforming, 60% no. It's slightly higher than in Europe overall, so that's part of the good news. But there is something strange happening in terms of incentives. The firms in Europe overall, the firms that are high energy intensive and that are transforming, they receive grants, and the others don't receive grants. So grants are really supporting the transformation. In Central Eastern Europe, what you see is that those that high energy intensive, they are transforming, receive grants, and the others too. So also is not transforming. So there is a little bit less of a policy direction taking place. And my concern is that the 60% that are non-transforming, one day they will probably close. And then they will not innovate, they will not take the time to innovate, to transform, to do something else. So at a certain moment, there may be business areas just closing, and there will be no substitute.
What are the policies that are necessary to decrease this 60%?
I think probably it's a matter, it's tough to say, because the fact that in the region is something I'm also personally very much thinking, and as an institution, it's tough to say, because the reason why in Central Eastern Europe grants are widespread is because there is a cohesion region issues, because there are social issues to support the firms. But if these doesn't really push the transformation, I think you really need to push the transformation in any case. So yes, you may find different ways to support for cohesion, but still putting pressure on the firms to transform. And I think on the automotive industry, it's very true what you are saying, because one day, so at the end, the value added is transforming and going to the computer and to the batteries. Mm-hmm. If the automotive industry in the region doesn't go producing the computer and the batteries, then will remain with very little value added, and will not be the driver of growth. There is a positive story on the other side. There are a lot of different contrasting data in this moment. There is a positive story on the other side. I was just looking at the data of FDI in the region. The Vienna Institute just published the report. If you look at the greenfield investment in the region, it's one of the areas where there are a lot of new greenfield investment coming. It's also IT, and that's that's positive. It's a positive development in the region to also have a shift in FDI also going to IT sectors, etc. That's a positive development for the future growth pattern. And I think what everybody that has been studying the convergence process, European integration process, is that the region needs more of this own grow innovation, innovation coming in the region, and the development of skills in the region as well.
Mr. Francois, greenfield investments, if they are in IT and green technologies, which are basically technologies with high added value, is it realistic that we put the production back to Europe if we are talking about mass production, which are the industries that don't have that big wages, and do we have the labor for things like that? What's your position about it?
So first, I would maybe not focus so much on industry as the activities that support industries, right? So what we're worrying about, in a sense, with the scope to have cross-border supply chains is what the occupational content of value added is. Right? Do you have people, is your labor force engaged in those parts of supply chains, whether it's vehicles, whether it's laptops, whether it's you know, I don't know, Komatsu mining equipment, whatever, that's more software focused, that's more, that generates a higher return per unit of labor. So, I mean, but that transformation's been going on for decades, right? So steel, if you think about steel in the 1950s, my image of a steel plant is these guys in asbestos coats walking into a wall of fire, pulling chains to pour stuff. Now it's a couple guys with PhDs that are in a computer control room drinking espresso out of their machine while they're looking at displays, and it's all automated, and vehicles are becoming the same kind of thing. And I guess you want those kinds of jobs, right? And so the direct manufacturing jobs are dropping off because things are becoming automated, because we've found better ways to do things. But there are returns from those innovations. And so, yeah, you want investment in that kind of activity. Also, again, in things like IT, whether it's IT backbones for finance or communications or whatever. The innovative parts of those is I think, what you want to be investing in. I'm going to circle back a minute again to autos, since that seems to be the theme of the panel here. So batteries also illustrate, we do have another strategic sector, which is dirt, right? So rare earths, but still another thing that you'd think is kind of boring, like wheat and chemicals. But the stuff we use to make the batteries is quite important in terms of having access to rare earths that are needed. And elsewhere, so I know the Australians are investing very heavily in sort of cheap battery alternatives, right, that don't use that stuff, that are based on more common chemicals and salts and things of that sort. And that presumably would also, I mean, it gets around some of these strategic shortage risks. So again, R&D, I think, is an important thing. One other aspect, looping more broadly to energy, is, so we've got the EU trying to tighten the emissions trading scheme system. Politically, it means they're putting in taxes on the border. They want to on other products that are coming in. But it doesn't really reflect the reality of supply chains. So you drive up the price of steel because it's very carbon intensive. You want to have an incentive for steel to be less carbon intensive. You put a similar tax at the border. You don't think about what's happening downstream, right? And we've seen this with other episodes of just tariffs put up on steel where industries downstream that use steel move, and they may not come back. So whoever makes washing machines or air conditioners or vehicles or things of that sort, where they're not directly responsible for the energy that's used to make a lot of the raw materials, and those raw materials get taxed. And so there is a risk, and that would also be true in this region, that if you're tied into the system that drives up the direct cost of carbon-intensive products, but not the cost of indirect carbon-intensive products, if you don't pay attention to the supply chains, that production, that downstream production may have an incentive to move away to some extent, right? to move sort of outside the region. And so there will logically have to be discussions, and I think this came up in the previous session as well. How do we measure carbon content, right? And this is another, this is not the economists or the bankers, or this is the lawyers. We're going to have to sit down and open up the tax and trade treaties and work out a way to agree how we decide that when something crosses the border, this is how much carbon is in it, right? Once that happens, then there will be advantages to greening the energy grid. There will be advantages to having, access to just massive amounts of energy that is, whether nuclear or not, but is at least not carbon-based, because then it becomes easier to tax that stuff.
Okay.
So.
Mr. Hudak, you wanted to react?
Yeah, just 2 points. I do strongly believe that the future of this region we are talking about, CC, is very much dependent on its ability to innovate. And the innovation is crucial. This is the only way how we can survive in the European and global economy. And I think this has to be supported by better policies in education. I think education is still very much kind of away from the real economy and the needs of the real economy, the modern ones. And secondly, there has to be much better alignment between the R&D and the commercialization of this. I think we are quite good in the region, also with the help, of course, of the EU funds, etc., with the pre-seed and seed financing of the new innovative things. But where we are lacking is the scale-up capital. So basically, I think it was already mentioned in the previous previous panel that those companies which are successful and are able to start, but then when they get to the level of so-called scale-ups and they need more equity for them to be able to grow and to compete globally, because in that situation size matters. They are not able to find it in the region or unfortunately in Europe either. So they have to go to US for IPOs, for spec operations or whatever, or they are bought by somebody from outside. So this part of innovation is critical. And a second point I would like to make is that, and somebody mentioned that not mentioning Ukraine in this context is a missed opportunity, and I agree. And Ukraine has a lot of talent in IT, a lot of innovation. Actually, the war, however tragic it is, but we know that the war also helps to bring a lot of innovation, because for country, people to be able to survive, you have to be innovative. And Ukraine, and we see it in our investment company, we actually have a venture fund where we invest into interesting Ukrainian startups, for example, drone technologies, very interesting things which are coming out of Ukraine, also because of this very tragic and difficult situation. But I think Europe should use it and create partnerships with Ukraine, also on the IT and kind of on innovation level.
Okay. Mr. Hudak, if I'm not mistaken, you have a plane to catch,
that's
so
correct,
we will excuse you. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And now I'm going to turn to the audience. If there are questions for our panelists, please just raise your hand. Do I see any questions? No? Okay, please. There is a lady with a mic. Mm-hmm.
Maybe to break the ice again, then. No, it's a question for Joseph, Francois. Regarding the impact of the green transition, right, on competitiveness and supply chain activities and location in Europe. So was your point that basically we mainly need the CBAM mechanism to apply to both the direct and indirect carbon content of imports, right, so that you really affect all the supply chain activities? Or did you have in mind something else? And second, is the something else the fact that, of course, the CBAM cannot address your competitiveness in third markets, right? Non-European markets. Thanks.
Okay. So I guess my answer is you need a different CBAM. The one is designed, there was a lot of attention paid to it being GATT legal. I don't think that it actually will have the intended effects and may have unintended effects. There's been a good bit of work recently, now that we have more data, looking at how much carbon is in the things we buy. Right, and in a sense, focusing on embodied carbon is probably the way to go. There is provisions in CBAM for sort of the carbon intensity on your immediate supply chain for imports. I see CBAM as being partly necessary politically so that you don't lose domestic support to raise the cost of carbon for certain domestic industries by protecting them from direct imports. But it doesn't recognize that, again, downstream industries are going to be affected generically by the higher costs, right? And so it's not that a system of carbon taxes is not the way to go, but it needs to be more, I think, better thought out and comprehensive. You need to focus on embodied carbon, not just of, say, steel directly, but if I buy a washing machine from Korea or something, how much carbon is in the steel if it's in that washing machine? But that means, in a sense, we need a framework, as was mentioned earlier, to think about how we measure carbon in stuff that enters the block. So I do think that's eventually where we're going. And if that's where we're going, then if you have invested in having a greener grid, then that means that down the supply chain also things are greener than from elsewhere. I'm just not convinced that the CBAM as it's set up is going to do what the intentions are. So I guess the short answer is a different CBAM would probably work, but not this one.
Okay. Any more questions? Or is the lady over there?
Thank you. Well, we heard from Mr. Hudak, but we had heard it already before, that EU is good as the pre-seeding finance and the seeding finance, so to say, but not then in the upscaling, which is really making the difference. So this question is for Ms. Revoltella to ask, what is the reason? And is there something we can do about it to actually allow for these SMEs to do the next step and then position themselves? Because indeed, when we look now, for instance, when we are trying to favor net zero technologies manufacturing in Europe, and we are creating the conditions through public procurement, but then we will need companies who have the capacity to respond to such public calls. So what can be done about it? Thank you.
Then I think I very much share the issue of the scaling up of firms and the concern that we have at the European level. And as the EIB, we are quite active in trying to support the growth of firms, and particularly we are particularly looking at the moment in which from the innovation side you transform and grow, and also the first of a kind, if you want, a project in terms of manufacturing. So we are trying to look at the whole spectrum in terms of policy support. And I think it's quite important to think in this way. So I always come as an economist. What you have in this case is a sum up of multiple, if you want, market failures, and then you need to have multiple responses. On the one side, we have on the green transition side, you have one of the market failure is the carbon pricing that is still not fully internalized. So you have, as an answer, you have the carbon pricing is coming one, but then you need also to subsidize the innovation side, because we have other market failures exactly in the innovation side. So you sum up instruments, and I think the combination of the two can be important. As an institution, I was saying, we are active both on the venture capital side. We have also product of venture debt that are actually quite useful in the scaling up of innovation in the last phase of the innovation after the firms has the first rise of capital and before preparing for the second one. We have an assessment of the product that we actually did, really looking at what is the effect on the firms that received this kind of financing versus other firms that didn't receive and were ex-ante identical. And we really see that the firms that receive the venture debt, actually they grow faster, and the reason is that actually they receive in the years after much better financing, additional financing. So they just become stronger firms because they have an investor like us that actually give two things, gives this venture debt product, but also a stamp of quality on the technologies, perceived positive in the market. So it's much easier later for the firm to raise better capital later. And I think somehow institutions like us can play this role, and particularly in new technologies, an assessment of the technology, providing a good financing, but also providing a kind of an assessment that the technology is an important technology going forward.
Okay. We have one more question down there.
Yeah, Julia Wertz from the Austrian Central Bank. So we've heard that competitiveness is a bit lacking in the EU, and for various reasons, and various ways to approach this. But one aspect that we've also been alluded to by the opening remarks by Boris this morning is the role of subsidies. I mean, he mentioned a very successful example here, this city of Ragusa, where he said they always used in their high times subsidies to promote their local industry. We have also been witnessing for decades now a very successful example, namely China, which has also heavily built on subsidizing its industries, and the WTO could never get a grid on it. So I wonder, is this probably the way to go? And how would we go this way in Europe with our competition laws?
That was a question for?
Well, I think at least Joe and Debora can say something.
Okay.
and I don't know.
I'll start, then you can disagree. Yeah, so subsidies certainly have to play a role here, and I think the difficulties in designing a disincentive system, i.e., taxes and so on, are becoming clear in a bit that they're problematic. And if we think about historical structural fund spending on things like highways and telecoms, cables and so on, maybe thinking not just in terms of subsidies individually to individual small agents, but about the basic infrastructure. What do we need to put in? And there is discussion on this in Brussels, right? So what do we need to put in place so that we can in future transition, say, to hydrogen? What do we need to put in place in terms of integrating the European grid so that we can generate wind or solar here and store it there? And so I think we need to think big on subsidies, right? So not specifically things to get individual firms changing, but what's the infrastructure that we need to support the transition? That doesn't get into as much of a problem with competition policy, I think. It does actually maybe avoid some of it. So if you have national players involved in putting these new ways of moving power around, of bringing in hydrogen and perhaps taking advantage of existing gas systems and so on. And so if we're in there from the beginning and it's not controlled by cartels that are, that I think maybe anticipates some of the problems we've had with the current system. No, I'm all in on subsidies, but I think they need to be big. We need to think in terms of a large-scale infrastructure. So.
I think it's a very difficult question. So it's a very difficult question to say what's the right amount of subsidies and where do you place subsidy and what should be the role of the public sector. I think what we see coming out of the pandemic is a massive role of the public sector in the economy. And I'm not sure I don't know, I grew up as an economist thinking the market works better than the public sector. And now we have back the public sector supporting everything. So my main point is maybe with the disclosure of where I come from, I'm not in favor of massive subsidies, but subsidies can be important if very well targeted to address a certain market failure. And in that case, I think it's important to have them if you really have the market failure and you address them. I think it's very important that we have them at the European level and not at the national level. And part of the exemption of state aid rule brings to some countries bring more subsidies to their own companies, and that distorts the market and the European single market. And this, I think we should have European instruments, at least looking in the medium to long term. Crisis response is fine, but in the medium to long term, if we want to have the benefit of the single market, we need to have European instruments, particularly when we talk about subsidies. And the other point that I have is that sometimes, and particularly in the concept of the net zero transition, subsidies are needed because we have to compensate for other distortions that are in the market. So maybe sometimes you have to also look at the source of the distortion that the subsidies needs to compensate. So a deep analysis of all the incentive system that we have and rules after rules that we have is important, I think.
Okay. I think we have maybe time for one more question from the audience, if there is any. If not, maybe Mr. Florence, do you want to comment on potential subsidies in automotive industry? Can it help?
I'm just online with what has been said, and if there is a lesson somewhere, it's just you don't have for one single problem, you don't have one single solution, and you have to adapt yourself to what is really necessary depending on your market, your location, and so on. So again, it's flexibility first. This means, of course, innovation, protection of the intellectual property, which has been a strong weakness in Europe in the past years, I think, and then education. So that's the three key things that we have to consider if we want to be at the top in competition.
Mr. Francois, do you see the right direction in terms of education at the moment?
It varies by member state, and it varies by the associate states too, right? Some yes, some no. And again, I think back to the Brexit example, right? With the UK dropping out of the Horizon program and not finding a way to backstop that. And so their role in sort of basic science research is put at risk, I think. And no, so it's clearly really important. It's clear that I think more money is needed up front rather than less. There is, I think, the move towards a bit more focus on European competitiveness is clear in the types of central projects that are called for. But we also need to think of how we incentivize firms to invest more in this R&D as well. And I think some countries do better than others in terms of ensuring that the kind of people that are the type of human capital that's being generated is what firms actually need. It's a signal of some kind of disconnect if you see that there's tons of job openings that are in certain areas of tech, and then there's lots of people that can't find jobs because they don't match. And so, but again, different countries have done better in Europe than others with that. Mm-hmm. But in general, yeah, I agree entirely. It's a key thing here. It's where the innovation comes from. It ensures that you can get the higher end on the supply chains. It means that you're better positioned, especially with IP protection, to generate the kinds of innovations that then feed into these newer products. So.
Okay, Madam Revoltella, some key points for conclusion from your side.
Well, I think I take back the point on skills, and I think that's a very important point for the region also because of aging population coming up, and because of lack of skills that are both lack of skills in terms of specific skills, and one particularly that is not only on the region, it's Europe overall, is a lack of skill for the net zero transition and on the digital side. And that's likely to be extremely binding, both in the private and the public sector. And there is not too much being done. There are attempts to tackle the problem. I think at the European level is the year of skills to try to raise awareness, but it's a complex matter. And what we see is that in fact, I think everybody who is trying to look at the net zero transition is trying to learn, but not all institutions can have the capacity to develop internally the skills. So it's a complex matter, and there needs to be a huge investment and transformation on that point of view. But in the region, there is also a matter of lack of people, and I think some of the countries, I don't know, I was recently told in one of the countries in the Balkans that some of the restaurants are seasonal in the sense that when it's a summer, they close because all the waiters, they go in another country because the salaries are higher. So there is a lack of people working. And that's a much more complex topic.
You are not going to name that country?
I'm looking at the governor. But I think that's a much bigger topic, and we have 1:37 seconds. Yeah. I think we can organize a different conference on this.
Okay. Okay, I thank you very much for your time, for all your observations, and I can only invite you to lunch. Bon appetit, and let's get back here at 2:30.